By December 1965, the Vietnam War had crossed a dangerous threshold. American forces were no longer advising from the sidelines. They were walking straight into terrain designed to swallow them. Dense jungle, flooded rice paddies, and unseen trench networks turned every step into a gamble. And when the weather collapsed, so did the plans. What was meant to be a controlled operation became something far more fragile. Scattered units, broken communications, and leadership wiped out in seconds. In this environment, doctrine offered little help, and hesitation carried a lethal cost. One small Marine unit would soon find itself isolated, outnumbered, and pinned down with no clear chain of command. Survival would depend not on rank, not on orders, but on a decision made under fire. How does a battle unravel so quickly? And when the rules no longer fit the reality on the ground, who steps forward and what risks come with that choice? Before answering, we need to go back to a rainy valley in central Vietnam. By the end of 1965, the Vietnam War had entered a decisive and chaotic phase. The United States had shifted from advisory support to direct large-scale combat operations, deploying Marine and Army units across South Vietnam in an effort to confront Viet Cong main force regiments head-on. Operation Harvest Moon, launched in December, was part of this escalation. Its objective was to disrupt and destroy the 1st Viet Cong Regiment operating in the Cu Ke Sen Valley, a strategically vital corridor linking coastal lowlands to mountainous infiltration routes from the west. Control of this region meant control of movement, supply, and momentum in the First Corps. The terrain itself worked against the Marines. Rice paddies, bordered by dense jungle, steep hills, and concealed trench systems offered the enemy natural protection and freedom of movement. Villages clustered at the base of hills provided cover, while caves and tunnels allowed Viet Cong units to disappear and reappear at will. December also fell squarely within the northeast monsoon season. Low clouds, heavy rain, and poor visibility severely limited air support and reconnaissance, forcing ground units to advance with incomplete intelligence. Of the 11 days of the operation, weather conditions were bad or marginal on most of them, complicating coordination and increasing vulnerability to ambush. Operationally, Harvest Moon exposed deep flaws in planning and coordination. Task Force Delta was an ad hoc formation composed of battalions from different divisions, many of whose commanders had never worked together before. Communication between Marine units, South Vietnamese forces, and air support was inconsistent, and secrecy driven by fears of Viet Cong infiltration left Allied units uninformed of each other's movements. The result was a battlefield defined by fragmentation, surprise encounters, and sudden collapses of command under fire. This was not a clean, scripted operation, but a test of adaptability in an unforgiving environment. At the center of this environment was First Lieutenant Harvey Barney Barnum Jr., a young Marine officer newly arrived in Vietnam. He was not a company commander, nor a seasoned combat leader. Barnum was serving as a forward observer, responsible for coordinating artillery and air support, an essential but specialized role that placed him close to frontline units without granting him formal command authority. Operation Harvest Moon marked his first real exposure to hostile fire, a stark contrast to the theoretical training and controlled exercises that had defined his preparation up to that point. Barnum's assignment placed him alongside Hotel Company, Doze and Battalion 9th Marines as they moved through the Kyu Sun Mountains toward Kai Fu. Like many junior officers in Vietnam in 1965, he entered combat with limited first-hand experience but immense responsibility. The Marine Corps culture emphasized strict hierarchy, discipline, and adherence to orders. Initiative was valued but always within the boundaries of command structure. Acting outside that structure, especially assuming command without orders, carried serious professional and legal risks. The reality of the battlefield, however, rarely matched doctrine. Communication failures, sudden casualties, and terrain-induced isolation routinely erased the neat lines of authority taught in manuals. Forward observers like Barnum were trained to assess terrain quickly, identify enemy positions, and make rapid judgments under pressure. What they were not trained for was the complete collapse of a company's leadership in the opening seconds of an ambush. In Vietnam, especially during operations like Harvest Moon, young officers were often forced to bridge the gap between military theory and brutal realities with no time to ask permission. If this story has drawn you in, take a moment to support the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what began as a routine movement would collapse in seconds. December 18, 1965, began with a cautious march through the Kusan Mountains toward Route 1, near the village of Kai Fu. The ground was rain-soaked, broken by paddies, hedgerows, and low risses that narrowed movement and hid danger. Then a soothing, accurate burst of fire tore into the column. Marines hit the mud as bullets snapped overhead and struck packs, helmets, and bodies. The ambush was designed to split the battalion into fragments, leaving small groups exposed and easier to overwhelm. In seconds, routine movement turned into a fight to simply stay alive, with no warning, nowhere to run. The first casualties were the ones a company cannot lose. Captain Gormley, the commander, was hit early, and the radio operator was killed soon after, cutting the company off from higher headquarters. Enemy fire pinned Marines down under a hail of machine gun bursts, and casualties began to mount rapidly. Worse, the company was separated from the rest of the battalion by more than 500 meters of open, fire-swept ground. With leadership gone and communications broken, the chain of command collapsed. Young Marines waited for direction that never came until Barnum moved into the storm. Understanding seconds were all they had. Barnum was a forward observer, not the company commander. And this was his first experience under hostile gunfire. His first instinct was to drop for cover, but the sight around him changed everything. Marines pinned down, scared, and looking for someone to tell them what to do. Barnum later said that anyone who claims they are not scared when shot at is full of baloney, yet fear without leadership becomes paralysis. He decided someone had to step up. In that instant, the difference between training and Vietnam became brutal. Doctrine was silent, and the enemy was close, right in front. Under extremely accurate fire, Barnum made a hazardous reconnaissance, searching for targets for his artillery. He found the rifle company commander mortally wounded and the radio operator dead. With complete disregard for his safety, he gave aid to the dying commander, then tore the radio from the dead man and strapped it to his own body. Then he did the unthinkable for a junior officer in chaos. He keyed the handset and told the tank commander that he, a first lieutenant, was assuming command of the company. It was not a meeting room decision. It was a survival decision for everyone. Once the radio was alive again, Barnum moved into the midst of the heavy fire, rallying Marines and giving encouragement unit by unit. He reorganized squads to replace key losses, issuing simple orders that cut through panic. Follow me, shift right, cover that gap. His calm showed, and it spread. He repeatedly stood exposed to point out targets, because hiding would have meant guessing, and guessing would have meant more dead Marines. He called for fires dangerously close, accepting the risk of friendly rounds because enemy fire was already certain. The company began to stabilize around his voice and actions. Support finally arrived in the form of 2 armed helicopters placed under his control. Barnum directed their attacks against firmly entrenched enemy positions while continuing to manage the ground fight. He marked trench locations with white phosphorus rounds from an M20 rocket launcher, creating unmistakable cues for pilots in bad conditions. When the marking rounds ran out, he climbed onto a tall knoll and stayed there, exposed to fire on all sides, still directing strikes by pointing toward enemy positions. It was leadership reduced to the most basic act, standing where everyone could see you, and refusing to flinch again. With the airstrikes biting into the trench system, Barnum pushed for a counterattack on a key position to the right. He directed 1 platoon forward, and when maneuver attempts failed, he led a charge that overwhelmed the machine gun nest. The effect was immediate. Pressure eased. Marines who had been pinned began to move, and the enemy's sense of inevitability cracked. Barnum described it later as calling plays, but the linemen were the young Marines and corpsmen beside him, doing the violent work of closing distance under fire. Their coordinated surge bought precious minutes to save lives for everyone there. Even after the line stabilized, Barnum saw the next crisis. Ammunition running low, wounded piling up, and the likelihood that staying put meant dying in place. He ordered engineers to blow trees down to carve out a landing zone, then brought in H-34 helicopters to evacuate the dead and wounded under fire. To increase mobility, he told Marines to destroy non-working machine guns so the load became lighter and faster. The logic was blunt. If a Marine fell while moving, another could lift him and keep going. "Marines don't leave anybody on the battlefield," Barnum said, and he meant it. As the battle expanded, Barnum was ordered to retreat, but the ground offered little cover. He radioed Marines in Kai-Fu and requested a base of fire to shield the withdrawal. A deep river blocked the route to the village, turning escape into a crossing under pressure. Barnum organized a leapfrog retreat, fire teams covering each other while squads crossed one at a time. Friendly guns from Kai-Fu raked the bank, slowing the Viet Cong. The plan held long enough for everyone to get over. Barnum stayed exposed and crossed last, so no wounded Marine was left behind. After 7 hours of fighting, the volume of fire finally dropped, and the ground went quiet. Barnum later said the Viet Cong were about 10 times their number, yet the company was not wiped out. The counterattack, close fires, and helicopter evacuations kept the wounded from being trapped where they fell. When the immediate crisis passed, Barnum helped press on and seize the objective, proof the unit had cohesion. The next day he learned he had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, but he insisted the honor belonged to the Marines and corpsmen who died and fought beside him. When the fighting finally ended, the battlefield fell into an unnatural silence. Smoke drifted over torn ground where hours earlier survival had been uncertain. Marines took stock of who remained standing and who had been carried away. What lingered was not victory, but relief that the company still existed at all. In the days that followed, the scale of what had occurred became clearer. A unit outnumbered, isolated, and nearly leaderless had survived because someone refused to wait for permission. The decision to act, rather than obey procedure, preserved cohesion where doctrine had failed. The cost was real, but annihilation had been avoided. For his actions outside chaos, Harvey Barnum Jr. would receive the Medal of Honor. The citation praised gallantry and intrepidity, but Barnum himself rejected the idea of individual heroism. He described himself not as a savior, but as a caretaker sworn temporarily responsible for the lives placed beside him under fire. Years later, Barnum reflected that leadership in combat is not about fearlessness, but responsibility. Fear was present, he said, for everyone. What mattered was direction. When young Marines were pinned down and terrified, they did not need speeches or medals. They needed someone willing to stand up, decide, and accept the consequences with them. Operation Harvest Moon itself would fade into relative obscurity, overshadowed by larger and bloodier battles. Yet the fight at Kai-Fu captured something enduring about the Vietnam War. Fragmented plans, brutal terrain, and moments where junior leaders carried the weight of survival on their shoulders. History remembers outcomes, but wars are often decided by. Barnum often compared that day to a football game, where visible leaders receive credit while unseen teammates absorb the punishment. The linemen, he said, were the Marines and corpsmen who charged machine guns, dragged wounded friends, and held ground long enough for others to live. Without them, no decision brilliant or reckless would have mattered at all. In war, obedience is essential until it isn't. The line between discipline and survival can vanish in seconds. At Kai-Fu, one forbidden decision altered dozens of destinies. It raises an uncomfortable question that echoes beyond Vietnam. When orders collapse under fire, who bears the responsibility to attend? Who pays the price if no one does?